Everybody, I want to welcome you to RUSI-VI, Royal United Service Institute of Vancouver Island here in Victoria, and our presentation today. My name is Scott Osborne. I'm the president of RUSI-VI, and today we're welcoming Dr. Howard Coombs, whose presentation is entitled Afghanistan, Canadian Strategic Lessons Identified and Not Learned. I know the audience will have reviewed Dr. Coombs' bio in the speaker's advert I sent out to all the members, but as a reminder, Dr. Coombs is an associate professor at the Royal Military College of Canada and is also currently the deputy director of the Centre for International and Defence Policy at Queen's University. He's also been a regular Army officer as well as continuing to serve as a reserve officer, and he's also in that capacity employed as a full colonel in National Defence Headquarters. He's certainly an experienced soldier. He's deployed twice to the former Republic of Yugoslavia and twice to Afghanistan, where I first met him in 2010. And he's also written quite extensively on his topic that we're going to talk about today. So today's presentation is certainly timely given the very recent fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban. And now is certainly the time to give some thought to the idea, the concept of lessons. However, the idea of lessons is huge. There are political lessons, military lessons, counterinsurgency lessons, nation building lessons, to name but a few, and then you can multiply that across the 46 members of the International Security Assistance Force, ISAF, coalition. So Dr. Coombs is only going to look at one part of that, and that is Canada's lessons from a rather unique approach, which was called WOG, or Whole of Government Approach to Nation Building and Security in Afghanistan. Dr. Coombs is going to talk for about 40 to 45 minutes, and I'm going to pose about half a dozen questions to kind of try to round out the discussion and maybe enhance a few points that Dr. Coombs wasn't able to cover in his presentation. Then we're going to go to questions from you, the audience. So please write your questions on the Zoom chat or Q&A features at the bottom of your screen, and please make them brief and to the point. We end no later than 2:30 today. We're recording this webinar. It'll be posted to our website ASAP. And for those of you who are not members of RUSI-VI, I have your email addresses, and I will send the link to our website to all of you so you can view this webinar again or part thereof, whatever you wish, or recommend it to friends. So thank you again, Dr. Coombs, for being with us today. And if you're ready, sir, please begin.
Scott, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And I know this is not the time to tell stories about you from Afghanistan, but I will say that you were one of the most talented liaison officers I ever worked with, without a word of a lie. And I've always appreciated your wise advice and counsel. So I'm going to share my screen and give me just a moment to get myself set up. Here we go. So as Scott said, I'm going to talk for the next while. Any questions that you feel free to post in the chat or get them, Scott, or ask once we're up and running. This is about Canadian lessons learned. And I'm going to talk about Afghanistan, about what we did in Afghanistan and how we did it and the lessons that arose from it and the fact that these lessons really haven't been sustained. And so we're going to pull all that together, and I think it will give fruitful discussion at the end. So this is how I'm going to look at our involvement in Afghanistan. And really, it's a tale of two case studies. I was very fortunate, as Scott pointed out, to serve in Afghanistan twice. I served at the beginning with ISAF-V, and then I served at the end of the combat mission with Joint Task Force Kandahar in 2010, 2011. And I'm going to try to pull it all together the best I can. And it's up to you to judge whether I do that well or not. But I would like to hear your questions in any case. So this is what Afghanistan looked like from a Canadian perspective. We started in 2002 with a light infantry battalion group with Operation Enduring Freedom. We went on to a larger contribution in 2003, 2004 in the area of Kabul. We started to egress to the south in 2005, 2006. By 2006, we were actually running what became a very wide-ranging combat mission that lasted on 2011. And then in 2011 to 2014, of course, we were engaged with the NATO training mission in Afghanistan. Now, throughout this period, one of the complicators in the domestic environment is that it's the perception of our operations. And I throw this slide up because I think that we can never really get far away from the public perception of what the military is and does. And although this has been referred to as the peacekeeping myth, and as many of the audience members already know, not always the reality of operations, it is the prism by which our actions are judged, not only by the public, but at times by our own government. And this being November the 10th, I thought it was fitting to bring out and highlight the fact that there was a pretty significant cost to our operations in terms of those we lost and those who were grievously injured and those who have passed on because of the operations in Afghanistan. So there is a reason that we should pay attention to what we did in order to garner those relevant lessons at all levels, tactical, operational, and strategic, and imbue them in the operations and activities our government does in the future. I also highlight this slide because Private Larson, it was the last ramp ceremony I attended in Kandahar, and Larson was under our command. He was under Canadian command at the time of his death. I'd also like to point out that one thing that always gets my attention when I think of Private Larson, who I never met, and although I did see him depart Afghanistan in the ceremony, was that he was 19 years old. He had less than a year in the Army from graduating high school to the time of his death. He managed to go through basic training, advanced infantry training, get some leave, get posted to his unit in Alaska, and then do pre-deployment leave and get to Afghanistan in less than a year. These were the coalition soldiers we served with, and we commanded. So it brings us to the fact that all these operations, particularly ones we did in Afghanistan, there is a multinational, multi-agency dimension to them that those of us who served in the 90s did not see. And one thing about Afghanistan and the operations that have followed in Iraq and other places, we are involved with agencies and entities and nations in a breadth and depth that we need to really give some thought of how we engage at not just a military level, but from a governmental level. So where does this all start? Well, Scott brought up a good point. This is about whole of government, but we step back to the early 2000s, about 2004, and we were talking about Canada in 3D, defense, development, diplomacy. That model became 3D plus C, commerce. And that's what eventually morphed to the whole of government model. And that is the model by which we view our activities in Afghanistan. It's not just about the military, it's about the government of Canada and its engagement with supporting agencies as well as other governments. I always thought that this quote from Prime Minister Harper when he was visiting Kandahar in 2011 really summed up the whole of government approach. And I thought it is an apt description as to the whole idea of whole of government. So I'll start off with the first case study. So picture the most powerful Newfoundlander in the world at the time, then Lieutenant General Rick Hillier. So General Hillier was the commander of ISAF-5, and his headquarters is based on a corps from Canada for the most part, with additions from other nations who were serving within ISAF. General Hillier's area of operations at the time, the NATO area of operations, was confined to the gray area on this map. So if you can see my cursor, that little blob right there is Kabul, and up north is which contained Mazar-i Sharif, which is another major city, as well as the provinces around it. That was NATO. All the green areas and the American flags that you see were Coalition Forces Command Afghanistan, which were combined British and American forces, and they were under a different command. And although there was liaison and communication back and forth between NATO at the time, there was no command authority. NATO did not have command of Coalition Forces Command Afghanistan. It was an American British entity. However, NATO enlargement was happening at this moment in the summer of 2004 because the Americans and the Brits were prioritizing Iraq, and they were moving forces from Afghanistan to Iraq. So they were encouraging NATO expansion. General Hillier's mission as the commander of ISAF was to support the Afghan Transitional Authority. And if you look at the mission statement that is on this slide, you will see that this is a reasonably well constructed mission statement from a military perspective. And if those in the audience who were in the Balkans and other places in the 90s, this all makes sense. This is what the military does. Now, General Hillier looked at that, and while he was there, he realized that there was all kinds of entities in Afghanistan doing all kinds of things. And remember, we were in a post-conflict period, so we're into a reconstruction, trying to shore up the Afghan Transitional Authority, get a functioning government. There's all kinds of folks and countries and coalitions and you name it, they're all doing different things. So General Hillier gathered members of his headquarters together, and I was fortunate enough to be one of them. And we did an analysis as to what was actually going on in Afghanistan and what was everybody trying to do. So after looking at the groups and looking at what the Afghan government, at the time, the transitional administration was doing, and the kinds of policy framework, which was the national priority programs, the consultative groups, the contractors that were involved, and trying to tie it together with the structured process for harmonized development of Afghanistan, which became the IMF, or not the IMF we're all familiar with, but the investment management framework, which, again, for those who had been in the Balkans, if you remember the roadmap that for development that was used in the Balkans, which was, if you put it up on a wall, would cover the side of your bedroom, all the different areas that would need to be covered as you reconstructed and rebuilt. That was what the investment management framework. But all of this together, everybody, all the groups, all the people involved had the general feeling they were trying to move towards this end state. If you look at the right-hand side of the screen, a legitimate and functioning state that provides for security and well-being of all the people in Afghanistan and tries to integrate them back into the global community. So all in all, lots of people doing lots of stuff, lots of groups involved, lots of money flowing in Afghanistan, no overarching kind of direction. So at the time, Minister Ghani, Ashraf Ghani, who was the last president of Afghanistan, of our supported Afghanistan, he was the Minister of Finance, and General Hillier and met with him, the Chief of Staff, President Karzai, and talked about how do we orchestrate all this. So General Hillier had his headquarters staff start to work on a strategic concept for the development of Afghanistan. And in the analysis, the center of gravity analysis, looking at the hub of all power in the Clausewitzian sense, we found there were disintegrating influences that revolved around the unaligned, non-aligned militaries. There were forces of up to brigade and size that were equipped with armor and in some cases helicopters, who were not aligned with the Afghan Transitional Authority, but were remnants of the forces that had been fighting and pieces of the old Afghan army. There were political sources of disintegration based on warlords and unaligned politicians who were not supportive of what the Afghan Transitional Administration was trying to do. There was an illicit economy, opium-based, that was going on, as well as smuggling back and forth of goods, as Afghanistan is a landlocked country. So there's lots of stuff pouring in and pouring out again. And there were popular sources of disintegrating power in that the people themselves had no confidence in their own government. So, and on top of this, so in the end, we thought this lack of internal confidence was a critical area, but also this was mirrored at the international level, because countries, and this when we're talking the early 2000s, and arguably you could say that this didn't change a lot, countries did not have faith that Afghanistan could become a viable nation state within a community of nations. So Minister Ghani at the time said his problem was he had over $2.5 billion pouring in over a 5-year period and had no idea how to focus his spending. General Hillier saw all of these, he had seen all of these organization, agencies, and people involved. He also realized that defense, based on his almost 2 years in the Balkans on different rotations, realized that defense and security doesn't exist in a vacuum. It is actually engaged with development and governance as well. And that's where we go back to the 3D model, which General Hillier was so pleased to talk about in the early 2000s, and our whole of government model. If you look at it from what was happening in Afghanistan time, General Hillier realized that the strategic concept was a security concept too. It would help establish security. So what we came up with was, after doing this analysis to attack these competing sources of power, the illicit money, internal a lack of confidence in the government, the online military faction. So we needed to actually focus this money so we could attack those problems. And so it started off with a focused plan of development, select high density poplar growing districts for development, to give them alternatives other than poppy, link those development packages with rural development packages with urban development packages, and the supporting goods services that would work along with those in a focused pattern. Now, if you think classic counterinsurgency theory, because this is part of the idea that informed our actions at the time, it's almost like, if you've heard the term the ink spot approach, where you start with your ink spots and gradually they enlarge and cover more and more geographic space. And that's what we were hoping to achieve, along with this focused development. And what was interesting at the time when we were working on this, we were reaching back to Canada. We were talking to agricultural aspects. We were talking to CEDA at the time, Canadian International Development Agency. We were talking to DFATE, Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, talking to our partners, anybody, any expertise that we could get to see if this had been mirrored, this kind of approach had happened in the past. And we found, yes, these models have been used in places like Africa, in some successful development projects and trying to do some nation building there. So we were on fairly firm ground, combining all the ideas that were coming in. We were going to link all this development package stuff with a transportation system. Then, of course, global border, an effective border force. Now, that's easier said than done. So those of you that are familiar with the geography of Afghanistan know the borders are incredibly porous, and there are major crossings based around roads, which is what we were trying to aim for. And those were the ones that we were pleased, but we would have to accept the fact that having effective border controls in Afghanistan and countries in similar geographic straits, very challenging, to say the least. And there would be supporting operations that would then be, security operations, police, army, and others, in order to enable all this development and governance that would be going on. And just keep expanding as you gain success. So what we realized, so we came up with this idea, this concept, we developed as a concept. And then we also realized that we needed to get people on board, because after talking to President Karzai and his chief of staff and Minister Ghani at the time, finance minister, we realized that the Afghans need support in doing this, and the Afghan Transitional Administration was not in Afghan Transitional Authority was not in a position where they could actually carry all this out. So they needed donor agencies, coalitions, Force Command Afghanistan, the international community, international organizations, non-governmental organizations, and ISAF to support this and to weave all the various parts together in order to have a acceptable output. So what General Hillier did, and this now goes back to ideas of whole of government, comprehensive approach, from an international perspective, we devised a plan to get everybody involved and to sell the plan, to take it from the idea, the strategic concept, to the shared vision. This is the slide that was briefed to General Hillier when he was Commander ISAF. And we had lines of effort: Afghan Transitional Authority, international community, military. And we shopped this plan around and this idea, and we got suasion. People were in general agreeing with it. So we created a PowerPoint package, a supporting plan, and we gave it to the Afghan Transitional Authority. We encouraged other agencies to use it. And this idea eventually was imbued within the Afghan National Development Strategy, which was the guiding principles for Afghan development up until, well, August. So here we go from a strictly military idea of a military mission at the beginning of ISAF-V, and all of a sudden ISAF-V is involved in many different facets, which are more than just military. And these are Canadians providing the ideas and impetus behind this. In the meantime, after 2004 and 2005, when ISAF rotates on, another country takes the lead. It was the Germans who took over, I believe, from us. We have the Manley Report. And remember, there was a lot of political debate during that period about our involvement in Afghanistan and some fairly acrimonious discussion in Parliament. So John Manley was given the task of chairing a committee that would look at our involvement in Afghanistan and make recommendations. And he recommended our continued involvement, and his recommendations provided impetus for a focused, coordinated, whole of government approach from a Canadian perspective. I saw that, and so did Scott. We all saw this come to fruition in our last year of the combat operation in Kandahar in 2010, 2011. And I want you to think back. We start with ISAF-V, Canadian involvement in ISAF-V. ISAF is a very small thing. NATO is just starting to enlarge. Well, 2010, 2011, NATO is responsible for all the operations in Afghanistan. It is a unified command structure, and it's divided into regional commands. And there is a focus on winning a war and building a government and rebuilding a nation. Canada, at this time, although we started in 2006 across a number of provinces, by 2010, we're focused into three districts: Panjwai, Daman, and Dand, which are here in the center of the map. And this is a depiction of Kandahar province. We gave up responsibility for Daman, but we gave up Daman, but we maintained Panjwai and Dand. And Panjwai at that time we dealt with the district leader was Haji Fazlud Naga, and for Dand, it was Haji Ahmadullah Nazak. They were both very interesting men in their own ways. Aga was a Mujahideen, a member that had been fought in the war as a Mujahideen, and he had huge contacts with the Taliban, with the insurgents groups, the Annan-aligned insurgent groups, business across the province. Nazak was at the time was in his 30s. He was very bright, very driven, and he represented a new generation of Afghans. So very different men, but both focused on running an effective governance structure in their districts. This is our mission statement. Now, if you recall, if you can think back to the mission statement we had at ISAF-V, which was purely really a security mission statement, this is the mission statement 7 years later. It's very different. It takes into account a whole government approach in order to conduct all activities in our area of operations. Operations orders and policies and directives that came out from the headquarters were couched in terminology that, particularly for unclassified documents, where it could be shared with our partners. And we talk here again, we're talking about DFATE and CEDA. And particularly with the representative of Canada in Kandahar, which ran the Canadian Provincial Reconstruction Team, where elements of all those organizations were. We worked with the PRT to attain these objectives. So you can see them across. Security revolves around building capacity in the Afghan National Security Forces, and at the same time, fighting the insurgency. Governance, connecting, building capacity at the district level, connecting that capacity from the district to the province, and enabling the province, helping to enable the province through the PRT to connect provincial governance to national governance. Can't say we were always successful there, but I thought we did a fairly good job at the district to provincial level. And development, we worked in hand with CETA and as well DFAID to address issues that would enable the villages and the districts to have a better quality of life. So I'm going to go through these in a little more detail, and feel free when we get into the questions if you want to explore them. I would like to say that this picture, I note that this is now retired Major General Dean Milner, who was the last Canadian Task Force Commander in Kandahar. And I'd also like to highlight Major General Ahmed Abibi, who is listening to this conversation, and I hope he gives me a seal of approval afterward. Major General Habibi commanded the 1st and 205th Afghan National Army Brigade and was an absolute joy to work with. So when we talk about the insurgency, so this is just a map of the ebb and flow of the insurgency, and this is what we were projecting in 2010, 2011. So the red line is basically based on the number of combat incidents and how they increased over time during the summer because the harvesting and most of the agricultural activities have been done. So there were more people free to fight, quite simply put. The blue line was where we wanted to get during that period in the year 2011. We actually reduced it below that, and we were actually had a flat. We had almost no combat engagements during the summer period of 2011, which indeed was normally the high point of all combat activities during the year. And I also like to highlight that this is the period where we segued out of Afghanistan, our relief in place with the 1st of the 25th Stryker Brigade combat team, which Private Larson belonged to. They were under our command until we did the transfer of command authority, or for some of you, change of command in July of 2011. Governance and development. Again, Major General Miller, but this is the governor of Kandahar at the time, a Afghan Canadian, Torlai Veza, and he was again a dynamic and very smart man. He was a governor that we worked with in Kandahar. So what did this look like? Well, here's some, we talked about, I said, we focused on Panjwai and Dan, the 2 districts. And here are some of the statistics that we saw in our last year of combat operations. So we have less fighting, governance and development is increasing. There's a lot of help from our partners to do this. This was militarily enabled by the security situation we were able to help establish. But at the same time, this work was done by our partner agencies and partner departments. So when they say Tashkil, it's basically your organization, it's your structure, your order of battle, so to speak. But your organizational structure. So if we looked at this, the first number is filled, the second number is unfilled positions that they have in their organization. You will see across the board for all important things like governance is the district centers where the district authorities and their staff work. It got better over time, much better. Schools, same thing. Clinics, my God, if you could go to some of the edges of the district, and these are villages, and they're very rudimentary. If you can visualize compounds, walled compounds with houses and walls made of local materials, there's open ditches which take out sewage, open ditches for water, wells, open marketplaces that you would see, that you can imagine. There's no refrigeration facilities, right? So there's no clinics. So we were actually helping get clinic services to areas where people had not had a doctor or nurse visit them in years. It was incredibly significant. So, and here's just a little bit of a scorecard on where we were sitting at the end. Leadership was pretty good. Processes in terms of governance and development were coming along. Financial, Dan had a cluster budget initiative, so they were actually coordinating the finances based on capacities that they needed to do within development. Panjwai wasn't, it was still being challenged. And in terms of representing the people and reaching out to the people, Dan had solidified some of what they were trying to do, that linkages out to the population. Panjwai was still working. One of the key things that we became involved in as a force, and I'm sure Scott could give a presentation on this himself, is about road development. If any of you have seen Hyena Road, well, that was based on Route Hyena. So Route Hyena is right there all the way out to the edge of the Pakistan border. So we created these roads for two reasons. The first reason is a very pragmatic reason. Paved roads are better for security because you can move forces faster, and the chances that that people can put IEDs of one form or another on them are lessened because we would regularly patrol the roads with air assets and land assets. So quicker movement, easier to get out. Supporting objectives. Well, when we look back at the whole of government objectives we had in terms of governance and development, having roads that people can easily move back and forth from what I used to call the hinterland to urban and rural centers is huge. It's a big difference. It's a game changer. People can move goods, like pomegranates, great example, move pomegranates from where they're growing them into a place where they can sell them, where there's refrigeration facilities fairly easily, as opposed to trying to get transport out along the dirt tracks that were passing for roads before that. So we put in place, the military, with support from our partners, put in paved roads in order to do that, but at the same time enabled many other agencies of government. One of the other things that the military did was we set up programs to employ fighting age males. And if you look at this graph, red depicting 2011, green depicting 2010, you'll see that depending on the time of year and what people were doing, the numbers vary. But what we found was that actually played a part for the people we were targeting were men and young men of fighting age, and that could be anywhere from 13 onwards or even younger, who would have time on their hands and would get involved with the insurgency because, well, bored, money, other reasons. But if they were engaged and they were busy doing stuff for the coalition, they were less inclined to get involved with the insurgency, and that actually bore fruit. And here's just a snapshot of projects that Task Force Kandahar was involved in over that period of time. And you can see it's pretty extensive. The employment of fighting age males, the local employment programs, the LEPs, were directly connected to these projects. And if you look at it in terms like mosques, it's hard to believe that the coalition forces are ungodly when they're paying you to fix your own mosque. So it actually had lots of positive spin-offs. So what did we learn in 2010, 2011? Well, it was a much more refined model of this idea of whole of government and the interdepartment cooperation that ran within Canada. We realized, I call it the paradoxical trinity of whole of government cooperation. And if you look at it there, it's a three-legged, we all love three-legged stools on PowerPoint. Well, let's pretend this is a three-legged stool. And each leg, development without security is unsupportable. Security without governance is meaningless. Governance without development is unsustainable. We had to work together to make this project that was Afghanistan work. And we had to do it not just about military efforts. So what we found was that at the end of the day, it was about relationships and common vision. It was about talking to people, particularly from a Canadian perspective, getting your arms around your brothers and sisters in the other governmental departments and agencies that they were working with. And I have to be honest with you, it wasn't just CETA and DFAID, it was the RCMP, we had CSIS, we had all kinds of organizations from Canada that were involved with us. Plus, non-governmental organizations, international organizations. So we had to work with all these folks, and we had to kind of gain consensus. Now, the one good thing was the Manley Report and the setting up the Afghanistan Task Force and direct coordination through the Privy Council office of all intergovernmental activities. That was enormous. So that really helped us by the time we were there in 2010, 2011, the strategic coordination. So I'm going to just recap a little bit. So what did we really learn in Afghanistan? Well, arguably, I'll say, particularly in the military level, we're really good at picking up tactical lessons. So, we have a whole process. The Army in particular has a lessons learned cell in Kingston, where I am located right now. And I'll tell you, the Army locks that stuff down tight. Now, whether it gets fed back into the training system sometimes, couldn't tell you, or procurement or doctrine. But I know for a fact, while we were fighting in Afghanistan, those lessons learned were being fed directly back into all the folks that needed, so to prepare rotations as they went out the door to go back to Afghanistan. So tactical lessons were pretty good. Tactical lessons in terms of whole of government, people recognized it, but there was really not as many formal processes to inculcate that in government or record them. But people were realizing at the tactical level, the members of DFATE, CEDA, and other governmental organizations realized this, and there were reports going back, but not so much coordinated. One of the big things that we realized is that joining up of those three pieces, the whole of government, that was actually accomplished by military folks, in main part, influence activities. So that was psychological operations, civil military cooperation, and information operations. Folks, they really worked a lot with setting up projects and doing that kind of things. They were enabled by combat engineers and construction engineers. So, but all that stuff was joined up by specialties. And I'll be honest, a little pitch for the reserve, a lot of those folks came out of the reserve. And they used civilian specialties to help join up all aspects of the whole of government approach. So very important stuff. We captured it from a military perspective. Yeah, it's locked down. Governmental parts, not so much. I think I would say that they did record it at the time, but whether that tactical level stuff for what is now Global Affairs Canada it was remembered, I would argue probably not. It was perishable with the people as the people left the organization. Operational lessons learned, ideas like how we were doing whole of government activities, the polio eradication program Canada ran in Kandahar, the Dala Dam project, the military activities we coordinated. Yeah, there was lots of things that we figured out, but I would say these weren't really sustained by anybody at any level. And then we get into strategic lessons identified. Now, there was a whole strategic lessons learned process that went at the end of the combat rotation, driven by the PRT in Kandahar, and also connected to activities of the Afghanistan Task Force, who wanted to put something together. Unfortunately, at the end of the day, all they created was a 4-page document. But in the myriad of conferences and everything else, which I was fortunate enough to participate in to a degree, I saw, and in the 4-page document that was the result of these efforts, these are the kinds of things that were identified as strategic lessons that we had to remember out of Afghanistan. Whole of government assessments to create and understand, define priorities and objectives. Having agencies, the different agencies of the Canadian government, work together on exercises to create common understanding, shared intent, understand what each other's doing, operational methodologies. Very important. I know this probably isn't earth-shaking, but it's have an interagency coordination committee at the political level, ministerial and above. That was the Afghan task force, which was disbanded. Have cross postings between departments, not really done. Create a deployable civilian capacity, because one of the problems we as Canadians found is, believe it or not every civilian in Global Affairs Canada wants to deploy to a combat zone. So having creating that capacity to field people who are willing to deploy in conjunction with Canadian security forces, Canadian military, would help the whole of government approach. Benchmarking frameworks, how do you give feedback on relevant measures of effectiveness on your progress as a nation within another country? And having strategic communications, engagement strategies, something publicable, publishable, and worthwhile. So this is a quote from 2014. A good friend of mine who may be known to some of you, he's a retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel, Bob Vokak, and great guy. He and I were ruminating on the whole strategic lessons learned business, and this he sent me an email with this quote, and he's given me permission to use it. And he said, you know, the reason we really need to remember lessons, these strategic lessons, is because we want to do it better. We want to be successful. And he was right. He is right. Well, because where were we in August of this year? Okay. And that's why I just want to touch base, because this is the proof in the pudding. You know, we talk about lessons. Well, and that's the difference between a lesson identified and a lesson learned. Lesson identified is something that said, this is a lesson. A lesson learned is something that this is a lesson, and I am going to make sure that I make adaptation to systems and everything else that this lesson touches on to change it for future activities. Well, I would argue that when we hit August of 2021, these ideas, the strategic lessons we identified in Afghanistan that were applicable to our evacuation effort, Operation Aegis, they were completely ignored. It was like we hadn't spent painful years learning these lessons. It was a compartmentalized, incoherent, non-coordinated response. It was embarrassing. We undersold ourselves as a nation. And considering that we had learned the right way to do this, and we couldn't apply even the most rudimentary forms, those strategic lessons, to Op Aegis, it's incredibly problematic from my perspective. It doesn't speak well of the future when we try to engage in activities in the international sphere that have security, development, and governance dimensions. And with that, I'm between 40 and 45 minutes, so I will hand it back to Scott.
Thanks for that, Dr. Coombs. That was excellent, very thoughtful. I just want to give you the opportunity to maybe expand on something a little bit. It's been 10 years since the close of Canada's combat mission in Afghanistan. What was the catalyst for you to start thinking about capturing lessons now? And why the focus on strategic lessons of the whole of government approach to nation building? Was it just Operation Aegis, their evacuation from Kabul, or was it other things that made you start to think more deeply about this?
Thank you very much for that question. It's a great question. So it's really, it's one of those things is, why do people do certain types of research? So for me, I'm invested, because as a military officer, I went to places, I went to the Balkans in the 90s. I went from a time where the military, we just did stuff on our own. We didn't know anything about the other agencies. We didn't cooperate. And over a 20-year period of deployments, I saw that, well, we get a lot more success, even at the micro level, when we work with other people who are non-military, and we could convince them to do the same things. And I saw that period, that learning. I was astounded when I got to Afghanistan in 2004 and realized that there was resistance at the strategic level from Canada and from NATO at the time to do something that was outside the military sphere. General Hillier was directly ordered by the NATO commander in Brunson to cease and desist, to not do anything that was non-military. And General Hillier, to skirt that, brought in Canadian officers from Canada as a Canadian Army planning team, because General Hillier was also the commander of the Canadian Army. And those of you in the audience that know him know that he's not going to take no for an answer. So he brought in Canadians who were Canadian Army officers under the Canadian operation who were not NATO affiliated to do the planning. And I realized when we were doing it, I said, oh my God, this is just such common sense. If we can focus these efforts at the strategic level, we are going to, it's not just about security. We will actually be able to set up structures that will benefit this country and help these people. And we'll do it in such a fashion that it will work and they'll be able to be up and running nation state like they were prior to the mid-1970s, because it was a functioning nation. So that happened. And then by 2010, 2011, I see that we're actually doing pretty good at this stuff. This is fascinating. And I have to say, I was really awestruck by how well the different parts, and then don't get me wrong, there were problems, there were challenges, but all in all, the Canadian civilians who we worked with, the government of Canada agencies, everybody else, we all were trying to do the same things, and we had mechanisms in place by which we coordinate our activities, and we were all pulling the toboggan in the same direction at the same time. We might not be doing things exactly the same way. We might not agree necessarily on what parts of the objective that are fitting or appropriate, but in general, we were moving down that road, and I thought as Canadians, we were doing a damn fine job. And I'll be honest with you, despite what's happened since then, we had achieved genuine positive objectives in the districts that we were working in. Districts were functioning. Governance was functioning. It was linked to the province. It was weak going from the province to Kabul, to the national level. We accepted that. There's never been a strong governance system between the regions of Afghanistan and central authority, and they seem to be able to work around it with the way they carried on discourse between the governor and the president. So that worked. But then now, Scott, here comes the crux of your question. Coming back, it was like, oh, within a few years, it was like every structure, the Afghanistan task force, the mechanisms within PCO, the ministerial involvement as a group in terms of multi-department types of activities, all seemed to disappear. And I became incensed, I would say, not distressed. I was angry when I saw how poorly coordinated our activities in Operation Aegis were. And I said, what have we done? It's like we have completely forgotten what just happened 10 years before, where we were, what we had achieved. And I believe, in fact, that's exactly it. Now, you could say there's many attributes: the speed of the collapse of the Afghan government, the withdrawal of American support, the lack of our own strategic airlift assets, available forces, the fact that our embassy down and left, and I will add, almost the only embassy to do so in total. We had no diplomatic assets on the ground, no IRC folks, but what I saw was a response that was led by separate ministers. Although there were joint press conferences, I didn't see a coordinated response. And from those who would know that I'm aware of, on the inside, every department they were united by the operation order or by the operational directives, but there was no real interdepartmental coordination or agreeing on objectives and processes and systems or anything that you would take as normal. I would even argue that what any of us would establish as normal coordination between different groups wasn't even happening.
Okay, thanks for that. I'm not an expert on nation building, obviously, but off the top of my head, I can see two different types of nation building. The first being that comes to my mind is basically the employment of the Marshall Plan in Western Europe upon the conclusion of the Second World War, and not just economic development, but also changing and building new political institutions in what was then known as West Germany. And of course, the Marshall Plan was basically fairly successful, but it was also, perhaps we can't call it nation building, perhaps we have to call it nation rebuilding. It was also conducted during peace after the conclusion of a war. The second example that comes to my mind is the one we've been talking about today, which is you're trying to conduct nation building while you're also trying to fight an insurgency, in this case in Afghanistan. Is nation building during a war, basically, is nation building a realistic goal while simultaneously fighting a war?
That's a super point, and I will say that that's a difficult one to answer. I would argue in the case that we had in Afghanistan, I would say yes. because the conflict was a low intensity conflict. It was a counterinsurgency. The nation building aspects were viewed, although we were counterinsurgency really isn't a strategy, it's tactics, and it drives operations at times. But I think if we look at things that drive people to join an insurgency, the root causes of dissatisfaction, they could only be addressed through the kinds of things we were doing to strengthen and build an Afghan nation. I think if we had ignored that at the time, we would have just had a series of combat operations that would fight the symptoms, but not the core problems. And I think that's where, in this case, I would say yes. But if I was looking at something that was more mid to high intensity, I would say you're right, and I would not try to do anything like nation building until we address the security aspects in a much more stringent and direct way, and created a peace, or at least a secure framework by which we could start the nation building. And I think, as you brought up Germany and even Japan, after the Second World War, are great examples of that. There was nobody would have considered nation building until we achieved decisive victory, which is what happened then. And then the Marshall Plan and the economic miracle that became Germany. And then those of us, if you remember the 70s, when Germany overtook most of Europe, and Japan was the same. So I think it depends on the root causes of the conflict and what you're trying to achieve with your fighting. Because as Major General J.F.C. Fuller, the British military theorist of the interwar period, said, I'm going to paraphrase him, I think I've got the quote almost dead on, but it's the object of war is a more durable peace. So how do you achieve that durable peace?
Okay, thanks for that. And I guess you could sum up and say that basically it's tailor-made. It depends on circumstances. There's no one solution to a problem.
It's the classic Canadian answer.
That's right.
It depends.
So on another aspect of Afghanistan is, could the fact that we were foreigners, foreign soldiers, foreign diplomats, foreign aid workers, not just Canadian or American, but obviously from all across the coalition, working in Afghanistan, can foreigners effectively do nation building without wearing out their welcome? And more specifically, in a country like Afghanistan, which basically part of its national identity is waging war against foreign occupiers. Do we as foreigners risk being seen as paternalistic occupiers, thus alienating the very Afghan public we're trying to help?
It's it's a great point you make, because it's one I wrestled with while we were there, and many others did, particularly the info ops, psyops folks, because I had lots of conversations with them about this. It was more than putting an Afghan face on things. You really need Afghans implicit within all the activities you're doing. We never got there. So in some areas, yeah, I guess we had, like, I know a good example in Kandahar is we had the Department of Women's Affairs, DOA, and we enabled the provincial government's Department of Women's Affairs through Afghan women who were working with the provincial government, and we supported them from behind and assisted them with, getting more women into provincial politics, in the administration, in education women, because they took a role in that. But we certainly weren't the lead, and we certainly weren't the face of it. But other things, like particularly sometimes when we're doing we tried to work development, the local projects, we tried to work through the local power brokers, as well as the MIRABs, the folks who ran the water system, and the district leaders, and let them take responsibility. But we weren't always successful. And sometimes our involvement was much more direct than it should have been. So you're correct. This really it shouldn't have been about a Western effort all the time. And it's about getting the people, you're really not successful until you get the people there to take ownership of what you're trying to support. And honestly, I don't think we got there in all cases. We did have significant gains. It There was positive movement, but a lot of it was still very much us. And I also believe General Hilliard, God love him, he also talked about Dead Fish Day. There's a day when everything starts to stink, and we were probably hitting that point in 2010, 2011. We needed to leave. And I think conditions were actually not bad across the country. If we had started to leave about that time, to reduce our numbers, start to move out. And in fact, the insurgency, the Taliban groups that were leading the insurgency, were actually in a position where they wanted to negotiate their way back into a seat in government. And for some reason, a number of reasons, I won't get into a long debate about them here, the Westerners involved in ISAF wanted some vision of decisive victory, very Napoleonic, and to win. And they wanted a capitulation of the type, in some ways, that we got from Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan in 1945. And that was wrong. We should have really just tried to create the conditions for a consensual peace, like buying a car, whenever both parties walk away, the salesman and the buyer, not feeling too hard done. They're not completely happy, but they're both not feeling like they did okay in the deal. That's where we should have left things. So I think we overstayed our welcome, as you pointed out, and we really didn't have the Afghan ownership of some of the programs that we were trying to force. And that probably should have told us something at the time.
Okay, thanks for that. Ryan Crocker, who's a diplomat, a very successful diplomat, I guess you could say, and a past United States ambassador to Afghanistan, recently wrote in an article for the Washington Post, which he wrote just shortly after the fall of Afghanistan. So it was really within the context of sort of grand strategic lessons. Recently wrote in the Washington Post that what was missing in the intervention in Afghanistan was strategic patience. By strategic patience, he meant that decades of effort were required to achieve any lasting success. And the United States, and of course the coalition, in particular, needed to stay longer. So can democracies, if that's true, democracies which are traditionally short-sighted due to our own 4 to 5 year election cycles and citizens' limited tolerance of casualties, exhibit the long-term patience to achieve any lasting success?
Well, short answer is probably no, we can't. And that's another good reason to be very careful about defining objectives and when you want to terminate the operations. And now that's a moving target. It's not something you can always predict in advance, but I think we need to be conditions-based, and we need to figure out when the conditions will be good enough for when we can leave. If any, and I know it's a well-informed group in RUSI, and we all understand the need for support, both from the host nation that you're working in, your domestic government, the alliance you're working within, why the populations have to be on side and have the support, because if they don't, operations can't continue, activities can't continue. So in a democracy with changing governments, I thought Canada did a really good job. The Manley report, the Manley Commission was inspired, and the report that came back laid out a clear pathway, and it also talked about when we should leave. And Prime Minister Harper's government, the Conservatives at the time, were adhered to the report the best they could, and then we stayed, and we gave further support to NATO, a little bit beyond where I think we should have been, but it was still within the realms of possible, and then we left. And I think it's just, I think on the whole, in retrospect, because I'll say that it's easy to sit here and now in the fall of 2021, after all that has transpired, in retrospect, I think somewhere around that time would have been a good time to diminish your activities and get things up and running.
Okay, thanks. In the United States, because there's been a lot of finger pointing, given the recent, fall to the Taliban, there's been a lot of criticism of the war in Afghanistan, as particularly highlighted by, again, the Washington Post, publishing a book called The Afghanistan Papers. And of course, one of the things it highlighted was US generals in media interviews, as well as interviews with Senate committees done in the public sphere, being misleadingly upbeat about success in Afghanistan. And I would just narrow that a little bit more to fit in with what we're talking about today. And that is that the generals often overemphasized, I think, to illustrate their success, achievements very narrowly in nation building, the rise in life expectancy, polio eradication, putting girls in school, for example. Now, these were easy to grasp and they often resonated with the Canadian public, and I assume with other publics in the ISAF coalitions. But in emphasizing these achievements, I think they might have risked distorting in the mind of the Canadian public the purpose of Canada's mission. Putting girls in school was good, but wasn't it a means to an end and not an end in itself? Or did nation building inadvertently become an end state on its own?
Well, yes.
Okay, next question.
No, but seriously, so all kidding aside, I think this relates back to your earlier question. It's about what resonates with your public and what are you communicating. So I'm going to step back for a second. So when I was talking to Lieutenant General Mike Gauthier, who was commander of Canadian Expeditionary Forces Command, who were responsible for the activities in Afghanistan at the time, we talked about the Canadian campaign plan. So he and I talked about the campaign plan, the purpose of a campaign plan. The purpose of a campaign plan is to orchestrate your military activities to get to a definable objective that's linked to whatever you're trying to achieve, a strategic objective. So Mike Gauthier said something that was prescient, and I was actually just gobsmacked by it, because I think when I think plans, and I'm sure many people here share my perspective, plans are military activities designed to coordinate forces in the conversation. So they coordinate activities. Now, if we want to work in a whole government environment, we orchestrate it so that it's supporting other government departments and their activities, if we can define them or kind of include it. What Mike Gauthier said to me was the campaign plan that Canada produced was not about a campaign, because we had all kinds of plans. We had ISAF plans, we had Regional Command South in Kandahar, their plans. So the Canadian campaign plan, sorry, ended up being a tool by which Canada's military and Canadian forces at the time could communicate what we were doing to the Canadian public. It became a communication vehicle rather than a plan to orchestrate military objectives. So I would argue that some of the things that you're talking about, while they fit within the whole of government rubric and some of the measures that we were using, they weren't directly connected with what we were trying to achieve. But were excellent to keep the public support maintained and allowed a perspective that we were achieving results. And that goes back to your original comments about high-level commanders being very upbeat. Success is only PowerPoint deep. And when you're relying on a PowerPoint dashboard that has greens, reds, and ambers, you can only do so much.
Okay. Professor Jack Granitstein recently wrote an article entitled "Afghanistan Goes to the Taliban" for the Legion magazine. His conclusion was in that article, and I quote, "20 years after 9/11, little has changed, and it is unlikely that any American government, never mind a Canadian government, will take on another war that has nation building as its goal," end quote. So in spite of identifying the need to capture strategic lessons in doctrine, for example, and I personally agree with you, and on the ground best practices, is Canada likely to get involved in another nation building project like Afghanistan in the future?
I honestly don't believe so. It's a huge commitment of resources, and to do it properly, I think it will take an appetite that no Canadian government will be able to sustain. Plus the fact, I think we have to look at it holistically in terms of the bills have yet to come in from COVID. There is going to be a lot of reorientation of the budgets, and we all understand that defense is one of the most attractive budgets to peer in the Canadian sense. So I honestly don't see any large-scale intervention in the near future. And honestly, to be frank, even the commitments that the current government made when in 2015 when they were elected to rejuvenate Canada's back in the world, I haven't seen any of those promises of even piecemeal commitment to UN forces come to fruition.
Okay. I want to give you finally an opportunity before we go to the audience for questions, and we have a few questions, looks like. Do you have any final thoughts about Canada's lessons in Afghanistan? Anything further you'd like to add?
The only thing I'll say is that some of the things that I'm talking about as coming out of Afghanistan are not new. This is the same stuff we were doing in the Second World War.
Some of it, yeah.
So there was a Privy Council committee responsible for the war effort, and that included many ministers. So okay, you can argue it is a version of total war in the Clausewitzian sense, and we were engaged in limited war in Afghanistan. But the idea of inter cabinet coordination as a standing body, and I do know that one was announced, but it really doesn't seem to be working. The fact that we don't really, as a matter of course, share ideas and coordinate between government departments and approach activities from a unified sense, particularly for a middling country such as ourselves, with limited resources, I find it's just astounding. And again, not something new, something we've learned in previous conflicts and emergencies. And I would also point out that in Europe, some of the smaller countries in Europe's defense, development, governance, all the whole of government kind of construct, they do that as a matter of course. They cooperate across departments. That's just the way they operate, and they coordinate across departments. So I just don't understand why we can't seem to learn from the things that we do, not just Afghanistan, but other fractious events in our past, and set up something that's permanent and ongoing.
Okay, just looking at first question I've got is from Leonard. And he says, reflecting upon lessons lost leading up to the problematic Op Aegis, was this not the end result of disinterest by the government of Canada, in that they were more interested in the forthcoming election rather than addressing the situation on the ground in Afghanistan?
I did numerous media interviews during that period, and I solidly sidestepped around any question like that. I always answered the question that I pretended I thought I heard rather than that question. But since now we're past the point, and I think in retrospect it's an informed judgment to make. Yes, I believe that this was not important to the government of Canada, our current government. I believe that the Prime Minister and his cabinet ministers were so focused on getting elected and did not see any need for them to be involved. That was the biggest challenge of Operation Aegis. But I also believe structurally, if we had an existing systems and mechanisms by which, as a matter of course, the civil servants and military officials who were involved in all those departments would get involved and just start to do things and present decisions to be made. If that system and structure was running, we would have obviated some of the problems that we had. So to answer your question, I agree wholeheartedly, but at the same time, I would also say this: some of that could have been mitigated if we had standing structures that were being used by our government.
Okay, thanks. The next question is, from Jamie Hammond. I think you know him. Great talk, Howard. As a part of whole of government approach, could you speak to the actual numbers of DFATE, CEDA, Justice, CSIS personnel that were posted to Kandahar province in 2010-11? Any idea on numbers?
Well, I don't have a clear idea of numbers, but I can give rough guesses based on my contacts at the time. And I talked a lot to the representative of Canada in Kandahar, the ROC, Ambassador Tim Martin, who was super to work with, great sense of humor, focused, experienced diplomat. So he ran the PRT. It was Canadian led. So we had, for those who are not au fait with the provincial reconstruction team, it's a headquarters that was set up in Camp Nathan Smith in Kandahar City. It included all kinds of representatives from different departments. It also had a large, very large American component from Department of State, USAID, and they all worked together to further projects. We also had engineers, a significant number of engineers there, who have construction engineers, field engineers who enabled projects and did the financial management of the projects, which it's huge. I never, as when I was an infantry officer, I never really cared about all that stuff. But over time, I started to realize that things like contracts and financial management, they're a big part of your operation in war and peace. So they did all that stuff. They had interpreters, and they had local nationals. They had interface with government. So, and with the provincial stuff, as well as the national government and our ambassador in Kabul. So Tim, if I can tell you that in terms of Jamie, in terms of numbers, CSIS was very small, literally a couple of people, maybe one at a time, maybe two. It just depended on what they were doing. Justice, not much bigger. It was very small contingent, but we also had RCMP. So we also had a number of RCMP officers. I would like to say a small section, probably about 5 or 6. And they worked with us regularly, and they were out helping build capacity with the Afghan National Police Force. CEDA and DFATE, definitely not as many as we would have liked. So we did have representatives, DFATE and CEDA representatives as advisors to the task force commanders, and they were embedded within the headquarters and responsive to the PRT, but they worked for the commander, and they did. And within the PRT, in terms of Canadians, I would tell you that there was never any more than 15 to 20 combined between DFATE and CEDA. And there were challenges getting those folks. Now, not because the folks that were there didn't want to be there, and they worked hard. It was because it really in government, if at the time, and I suspect it's the same with GAC today, working in the hinterland, doing things in the regions like Kandahar are not the international positions that allow you to move in the department. And so we, in the end, a lot of our DFATE and CEDA folks, so while we did get solid career diplomats and development experts, we also got a lot of folks who were contracted to work for the agencies to come to Kandahar, or were transferred in from other departments because they were willing to take a more active role in Canada's engagement in Afghanistan. So the numbers were relatively low, but the people there really did do sterling work. So I can't fault them for that. And they, in combination with our American allies, if I was to look at the PRT, I would say there was at least 80 to 100 civilians there doing various things in development and governance. I know it's not the exact figure I'd like to give you, because I know you're very precise about numbers and getting an answer to your questions, but sorry, it's the best I could do right now.
Okay, thanks for that. A question from Dawn. Are many of those fleeing Afghanistan not the very people needed for Afghanistan to rebuild? Are we doing more damage than good for future efforts in rebuilding the country with a functioning government by helping so many to leave?
It's a good point, and one I've heard before. I've actually heard it couched as these are the people who need to lead the resistance. I would say, if I was to contextualize it, one thing that struck me for the people that stayed in Afghanistan, so a lot of people, remember, Afghanistan, there's been fighting since the 1970s. It's been nonstop. So we're talking about a country it's 50 years of war. Generations have grown up not knowing peace. There is a huge diaspora in the bordering countries of refugees, huge refugees, internal displaced camps. Anybody with the wherewithal to leave Afghanistan, for the most part, left years ago. Those that stay are there because their choices are limited, or they actually believe in what they were trying to do. So there's some context here. So the people that we're trying to focus, I would argue, the people that I was engaged with, or same with the veterans community, were those that supported our activities. Yes, they are the types of people, the driven people that you would want to stay and build a country. But if they stay, they are targets, and that's happening now. I was just reading some unclassified reports coming out of the U.S. On some of the things that is happening across Afghanistan. It's no secret that the Taliban and affiliate groups are targeting people that support the coalition forces. And so if they stay, unless they start fighting or go underground, they probably will not have a positive outcome. Now we talk, if Major General Habibi's still online, I was telling Scott, he was in the president, he supported the Afghanistan government. He was in the Afghan military prior to 1995. When the Taliban took over, he was in prison for years. He was released just prior to the invasion of Afghanistan by coalition forces. He then rejoined the military and became a major general, and then Afghanistan collapsed. If he had stayed in Afghanistan, he would have been targeted by Taliban. And quite frankly, in discussions we've had, he's fairly certain of what the outcome of that would have been. And his family was threatened as well. So staying wasn't really an option. But yes, I agree with you. These are the people that we would like to see stay. But if they stay, what happens to them? So I think that's the double-edged sword. Now, speaking to the larger number of 40,000 that we've assured that we're going to accept into Canada, particularly from endangered groups, I would say, frankly, that they were marginalized populations in any case, and unless there was a stable government there to support them, their influence would be very small.
Okay. Don has a second part, I guess, to this, and it says, with leader-centric, Prime Minister office-centric government, how can we have effective inter-cabinet coordination possible? PMO permission is a prerequisite as ministers' roles have declined in stature so much. And in fact, that's specifically been the topic of several articles, I think in the National Post and the Globe and Mail, that ministers are less than what they were in the past.
Yes. So again, simply the answer is yes. I believe in structure and process. Okay. All right, let's step back. So if the people that know me, they're in the audience, when I say I believe in structure and process, that's been a long journey of over 40 years. Okay. Okay. So I'm a big believer we can put process and structure in place. It takes over sometimes when from political authorities. Ministers are elected, civil servants are not. We have some very powerful civil servants in government, and they stay in the shadows a lot of the time, particularly deputy ministers, not so much for defense, but staying in the shadows, that is. But the fact of the matter is, if we set up systems that are, and I hate to say this out loud, like the National Security Council system that the United States government has in place, where they have the undersecretaries are actually advisors, and they do a lot of, there's undersecretaries committees that work all these issues before they go to the, what we would call the ministerial level. I think there are those types of systems would enable these kinds of mechanisms to a certain degree of effectiveness, whether there was we were prime minister centric or not. So I guess I agree with your point to a certain level, but I also believe that if we had the right systems embedded in our structures of government that and processes, that it would just happen as a matter of course, and in certain cases decisions would be forced to the top.
Okay. I think we're coming to the end. I don't see any more questions, but I'm just going to mention to our audience that Dr. Coombs has written two very interesting articles on this very topic, from which is sort of the baseline to expand into a presentation for us. But I have everybody's email address, and so I'm going to send links to those articles if you're interested in this topic, and you can sort of read the articles and get a little bit more detail on some aspects that Dr. Coombs has managed to cover today. So I want to thank you for an excellent and very thoughtful and thought-provoking presentation on the Canadian strategic lessons of our war in Afghanistan, and also the time that you had to dedicate to this to explore and think about this very complex, but obviously a timely topic. And I want to thank you personally for your time and effort in putting this presentation together and spending your afternoon with us. So on behalf of the members of RUSI-VI and our guests, Howie, thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for listening today. I hope it was somewhat enlightening and not too boring. Have a great day. It's dark here in Kingston, and I've got a dog, as you can tell from the paws, a dog that wants to go outside. So take care now.
Okay, thanks, Howie.
Bye.
And for everyone else, that ends our presentation. Thank you very much. Our presentation will be posted in the next probably 24, 48 hours on our website, and I'll send out that link to everyone participated today. Thank you very much.